Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Stormkeep. My name is Paul, and today I'm joined by...
Hey, y'all, it's David.
Wanted to do a quick video today about deployment. It is a topic that we have been requested to make a video about forever, because it is one of the most important aspects of the game, but also one of the most complicated things to learn. It is very unintuitive exactly how you're supposed to deploy your units. There is no direction given, and the difference between mastering deployment and just putting your units down on the table is massive. It is absolutely a keystone of competitive play, and it's something that you can definitely get better at. I'm even still getting better at it every single time I play a game. Before we start the video, I'd like to give a shout out to the sponsor of this episode, Mindtaker Minis, a community-focused shop in Vancouver, Washington. They provide space for local clubs and groups for wargaming and RPGs alike. They carry modeling supplies, terrain, dice, and have a sizable collection of 40k, Age of Sigmar, and Warhammer Fantasy in stock. In addition to reselling Warhammer, they will also buy your unused miniatures. If you've got a big pile of shame in the closet, you can turn it into cash or trade it in for store credit. Visit mindtaker.org and use code STORMKEEP5 to get 5% off your next online order. Thank you to Mindtaker Minis for sponsoring this episode, and now on to the show. First up, just quickly covering the deployment rules in case there's any confusion. We can lay the groundwork here. So the first thing you do is you roll off for attacker and defender. The attacker deploys first, and then the defender deploys their units. You alternate deploying units one at a time until one player is finished, and then the other player deploys everything in their army. The order of deploying units is, first up, both players have to deploy faction terrain. So the attacker deploys their faction terrain first, then the defender. Then you go back and forth deploying units. You can choose to deploy units one at a time, or you can choose to deploy an entire regiment all at once. And after using your deployment abilities, you use all abilities that are used in the deployment phase but don't have the deploy keyword, such as Bastion's Castellan of Azir ability. This is used after all units have been deployed. The first thing with deployment is that you should try to deploy in range of your friendly abilities. This is a mistake I see new players making all the time. They will forget that, oh, this ability has a range of 12 inches from this hero, or this wizard wants to cast a spell and the range is only 12 inches, and the unit I wanted to cast it on is just slightly out of that range or just on the other side of the board. This is just the first step of many to learning how to deploy. Is you have to know what your abilities are, you have to know which hero wants to put which buff on which unit, and you have to put these units in range of those effects. Now, you may think, now, in some cases, you can move and then still activate it, like if it's an aura ability, but given how Age of Sigmar 4th Edition has a lot of reactive play, there's even times where you want to make sure you deploy your units in that range. For example, if you're a Lumineth Realm Lords player, you may want to make sure that most of your army is in range of a single hero who can cast Protection of Hysh with Magical Intervention. That hero could even be Techless, who automatically casts it on a 10, and that is a pretty good way to get a 5-up ward in your opponent's turn and stymie aggression. Other abilities that you'll frequently see used in the hero phase are things like the Ash Cloud Rune from Fire Slayers. That requires units to be wholly within 12 inches. You can use that in the enemy hero phase, and for the whole turn, they just can't be shot. You've got Seraphon using buffs like Speed of Quan Chi, which allows you to make any Seraphon unit run, shoot, and charge. If you're not deployed properly, you won't be able to cast that spell. The next thing to consider, past just how your own army works, is the battle plan, the objectives. Now, Age of Sigmar is not a deathmatch game. All that matters for your victory is having the most victory points. And the way to gain victory points is usually by standing on these circles and scoring battle tactics, but we'll talk about those in a bit. Tabling your opponent does not result in a victory, unlike in some other games. Even if you kill every single model in the opponent's army, if they have more victory points, they win. So you should consider your own unit's ability to stand on objectives when you deploy them. If the objectives are in the middle of the board and you have units that are too slow to get to those objectives, make sure you deploy them as close as possible or consider putting them in reserve so they can just drop into play on them. Some things I see new players doing wrong all the time is how you control an objective. They may not realize that objective control is determined after all deployment phase abilities and at the end of each turn. So, for example, you could start by deploying directly onto your objectives, or you can choose to leave them empty. There are strategic reasons to do that. Since objective control is checked at the end of each turn, you don't have to move onto it during your turn in the movement phase, or even in the charge phase, or even in the combat phase. You could move onto an objective with a power through or a similar end of turn ability. As long as you are ending your turn on the objective, that's the only thing that matters. You also don't have to stand in the middle of an objective. You can stand just, toe in on one edge of it. such as the Knight Judicator in the picture here. There's also usually no direct benefit to controlling an objective. And now, some abilities, of course, will activate from contesting objectives. There's a lot of these in 4th edition. But in general, it's not like you get +1 to save or +1 to hit for all units just from standing on an objective. They, on their own, they only are worth victory points, and they're only worth victory points if you control them at the end of the turn. And objectives remain under your control until your opponent takes control of them. So you don't have to leave units defending objectives, even though sometimes you may want to do that. It's not something you have to do in order to keep scoring off of them. Here's some quick tips for deployment based on objectives. So first up, most battle plans don't require you to hold all the objectives. They usually, score 1, score 2, score more in a battle tactic, and that's pretty standard. So just having 1 or 2 is usually how you get most of your points, usually about 40% of your points for the turn. Control more usually contributes another 20%, and then your tactic usually contributes 40%. Now, it's usually a good idea to deploy on objectives, but not always. I would say it's usually a good idea, especially on battle plans like Feral Foray, which has 6 objectives, 3 in each player's territory. That one requires controlling more objectives than your opponent. If you only deploy on 2 objectives, then your opponent can deploy on all 3, and they right away have a control more, almost guaranteed. Another common mistake I see new players making all the time is trying to control every objective and trying to control them as soon as possible, and trying to score as much victory points as possible. I know I said that the game is determined at the end who has the most victory points, but it's determined after 5 rounds, not after 1 round. So although it is beneficial to score as much as you can whenever you can, there's a lot of times where it's better to hold back, sit back, preserve your resources, and then win after 5 rounds rather than after 1 round. All that matters is having more victory points at the end of round 5. You need to strike a balance between your tempo, which is like scoring your victory points, and the resources that you have, which is things like board control, tactical options, your ability to make plays. Objectives are controlled through movement. If your units don't move, you can't get onto the objective. Games are won through movement. This is especially important for Stormcast players. We are a heavy shooting army. Shooting is done after movement, so if you clear out an objective with shooting, then there's no opportunity for you to then move onto it or charge onto it if there's nothing left on the objective. This makes movement phase and hero phase damage very useful, since it can create space for you to move. In this game, the Lumineth player deployed his Dawn Riders centrally in order to threaten all available objectives in the middle of the board, as well as push into the enemy territory down south. The Dawn Riders move a blistering fast 14-inch move, and they can get an additional 4-inch move from Speed of Hish. They're a very fast unit, and playing them centrally allows them to threaten all the objectives like this. On the other side of the board, the Stormcast player deployed Vanguard Paladors within range to charge the 2 left objectives. Because they have a 14-inch move with a run and charge, they can be further deployed towards the back of the board, further away from your opponent, making their charge less likely, but still within a comfortable range to contest the central objectives. You may notice off this deployment that there are no units that can contest the right side objective reliably, but the Stormcast player has units in reserve that can contest any empty objective. Moving on from just objectives, there's other stuff on the board, and that stuff should be terrain. You should be playing with terrain. Lots of terrain. Terrain is fun. It makes the board more than just an empty field for your 2 armies to clash in the middle. Terrain is very fun, and you should be using it. There's various different rules for terrain, and all of them can be used to your benefit. Cover gives enemies -1 hit when attacking you, unless they charge that turn. So if you're sitting on top of a piece of terrain, you will have -1 hit against you. Keep in mind, though, that flying units cannot benefit from this effect. So Prosecutors, Stormdrake Guard, Knight Azuros, all of these units cannot benefit from cover. Obscuring is arguably the most powerful of all the terrain rules, because units wholly within the terrain cannot be picked by missile weapons in any phase, so if Vanguard Paladors try to shoot a unit that's hiding inside obscuring terrain, they will not be able to do it. Even after they charge, they will not be able to pick that unit with their missile weapons. And of course, obscuring terrain usually also gives units cover. And flying units can benefit from neither of these effects, so you cannot hide a unit of Prosecutors in obscuring terrain. It can be very useful to deploy units in this kind of terrain in order to avoid shooting. In particular, because you can shoot out of the terrain, as long as there is less than 3 inches of terrain between you and the target, you can shoot out of the obscuring terrain, but they can't shoot into the obscuring terrain. So a common strategy is to deploy shooting units inside. They can shoot, but can't be shot back. Impassable terrain is exactly what it sounds like. Models cannot move across, be set up on, or end moves on this terrain. Flying units can pass over it, but they still can't end on top of it. Impassable terrain is very important to controlling melee charges in this game. Look for pieces of terrain that are impassable and try to fill them with screens in order to slow down your opponent. Or you can even create your own choke points with your faction terrain, placing it more than 3 inches away from a piece of impassable terrain on the battlefield. If you're curious about this sort of thing, check out our quick tips video on Stormkeep episode 74, Forbidden Power, for more details. Places of power are great. They give a hero, wizard, or priest +1 to casting or chanting rolls. And if that hero is not a wizard or priest, they can use Unbind and Banish. Adds some extra utility to your units and makes your casting and chanting more reliable. Now, it's usually a good idea to deploy near them and try to use them every single turn. Bonuses on a 2+ are usually worthwhile. Spell and prayer ranges are usually only max 18 inches though, so sometimes these pieces of terrain can be tucked away in a corner, and that'll be too far away from where most of the action is happening on the battlefield. Don't get baited into deploying on a place of power just for that +1 bonus and then find out that none of your abilities are going to be in range. Worth noting some interactions here. If a priest uses the place of power, they do not gain the Unbind ability. That is only available if a non-wizard or non-priest uses it. Also worth noting that it can't be used by non-hero units like the Storm Coven. The Storm Coven are a wizard, but they're not a hero, so they can't activate the place of power. In your area, do people use the terrain maps that are suggested on the battle plans, or do you guys have players place terrain?
No, so this is the weird part. So we use the actual terrain maps. The issue that comes up is that this is not 40K, where every table is the same exact 7 buildings. So it's kind of like when you go to big AOS tournaments where each table has a mixture of terrain. You could just not play with the woods. You could just be 8 pieces of pillars,
In this game, the Ogre player was forced to go first, but he had deployed his army in such a way that he could take advantage of terrain. 2 of his Huskard on Stonehorn were able to deploy close enough to the place of power so that he could move into range and gain their benefit on the following turn. Many of his monsters deployed near or on obscuring terrain, and he moved into them immediately. Moving his units into the obscuring terrain like this gave him great protection against the Stormcast shooting on the following turn. Alright, so we've talked about how to deploy based on objectives, based on your own army, based on the terrain, but there's still one last detail that kind of ties it all together, and it's who is going first. This is a question you need to ask yourself before you put any models on the table. When you look at lists and one person has less regiments than the other person, well, that person can finish deploying first, so they're going to get to pick who gets to go first. Sometimes this is you, sometimes it's your opponent. But either way, knowing who has control over it is going to affect how you deploy. Going first is not necessarily a good thing or a bad thing. There are pros and cons to it. If you deploy it aggressively and you go first, you can deal a lot of damage before your opponent has a chance to move and has very little opportunity to put any defensive abilities up. You can use minimal resources in order to max score with little interference from your opponent. You can move your units, spreading out to deny space for reserves and teleports, and brace for a potential double turn from your opponent. You're more likely to win the next priority roll, and if you deploy wizards out of range of their unbind abilities, you can cast without worrying about their unbinding. But of course, there are lots of downsides to going first in the first round. Of course, your opponent will see your full deployment before you see theirs, and deployment knowledge is power. Knowing exactly where to put your units in order to get the most efficiency out of them is key. Your opponent also has a chance for a double turn in round 2. If they go at the bottom of round 1 and the top of round 2, and they're in position, they can deal tremendous damage to you. If you deploy too defensively, however, you may not be able to deal any significant damage. So you have to find the right mix of aggression and defense with your deployment. And of course, your opponent knows where all of your units are, but especially your wizards, so they can deploy unbind units in range. The player that finishes deploying their armies first chooses who goes first in round 1. There's no randomness in deploying your units. It's not like you deploy D3 or D6 units and then your opponent. No, you know who's going to finish deploying first as soon as that attack or defender roll happens. If you're going to finish deploying first, you can deploy very defensively and force your opponent to go first, take very little damage. If you're not going to finish first, then you need to be reactive to what your opponent is doing. You can be neither too aggressive nor too defensive. If you're too aggressive, your opponent can decide to go first and hit you before you're ready. And if you're too defensive, well, then your opponent can force you to go first, and then you deal very little damage to them, and you're exposed to a potential double turn.
Okay. So if I No, I'm going first. I try to play a little more defensively. Like, I don't mind giving up some points turn one, so I don't lose on a double into two. Usually, I think the important part with Stormcast is to make sure you have units that could do easier, quick tactic for you turn one, where you're not giving up too much. So, like example, if you have Paladors, like they move 20 inches, you can go touch a corner for take the flanks. Or sometimes, like a lot of armies have like just throwaway units. If you're able to, I've done this a lot against Gits. I'll hit something with my Paladors, but I'll touch something weaker, like their screen unit or something, and I'll power through them to get my tactic, and then I'm also safe away. So I think the biggest thing is if you're going first, you want to just keep your army as safe as possible.
In this game, the Lumineth player had fewer drops and deployed very defensively in a castle formation, then forced the Stormcast player to go first. Because of the Lumineth player's very tight formation, the Stormcast player was unable to do any significant damage, and instead chose to keep his distance to mitigate a potential double turn from the opponent. The Lumineth player was only able to make this decision and deployed in such a way because they knew they had fewer drops than the Stormcast player. If they did not have the decision to go first, or force the opponent to go first, then they would have deployed in a very different way. Now that we are out of the basic deployment information, we start to consider what your opponent's army is doing. And I want to have a quick primer on threat ranges. And what a threat range is the maximum possible distance that a unit can project power in a single turn. For example, if you have a unit with a 6-inch movement characteristic, and let's just say it's a melee unit, then it has a threat range of 18.5 inches because it moves 6 inches and it can potentially charge 12.5 inches. If you're more than 18.5 inches from that unit, it just can't do any damage to you the next time it moves. But of course, remember that enemies can redeploy in your turn and it messes things up, but we're not going to worry about that yet. That's a little bit more advanced. If that same 6-inch move unit can shoot 18 inches, then it has a threat range of 24 inches because it moves 6 inches and then it shoots 18. If that unit can run and charge, it has a threat range of 24.5 inches because it can move 6 inches, it can run 6 inches, and then it charges 12.5, potentially. Now this becomes much more complex when you factor in reserves and teleports, but we'll talk about that later in the video. So as an example, Vanguard Paladors are one of the highest threat ranges in the game. They can move 14 inches, run 6 inches, shoot 12 inches, charge potentially 12.5 inches, shoot 3 inches, pile in another 3 inches, and then attack something within 3 inches. So they have a really, really high threat range. Knowing the threat range of units, both your units and your opponent's units, is a keystone of competitive play. And this can be overwhelming because this is a very complex game and every unit has its own unique stat profile. So here are some questions you can ask your opponent before your game starts. Which units are your fastest? How far can they move? Which units can run and charge? Does the run and charge effect come from a spell? In which case, it can be unbound and you can deploy wizards in range to try to unbind it. Which units have a 3d6 charge, something like prosecutors that roll 3 dice when they charge instead of 2? It's important to know which units these are. Does that ability come from a spell? In which case, you could try to deploy a wizard in range to unbind it. You can ask your opponent, do you have any reserves, or do you have any units that can teleport? And if they can teleport, does that come from a spell?
Yeah, I try to measure my opponent's threat ranges. I usually in general, I'm like if it's like a really good melee unit, and I know the only way is they're just gonna move and charge, I'll probably like stay like 11 away. Make them have to roll 11-inch charge or 12-inch charge because I'm like, if you roll boxcars, I guess that's fine. But I think it's a lot of like sometimes like min-maxing with your opponent's threat ranges, right? Like it doesn't make if your opponent has an 18-inch threat range, right? Let's say just like trolls move 6 inches. So let's say they have an 18-inch threat range, right? Like there's no sense in being 24 inches away, right? Because you're just putting yourself way out of tactical viability to like counter. So like really understanding your opponent's threat ranges and maybe trying to gamble a little bit with them will sometimes pay off, and I've done that a lot during my games.
I'm not much of a gambler. If my opponent has a As an 18-inch threat range, I will be 18.6 inches away. So even if they roll boxcars, they can't finish a charge within half an inch. I like playing as low variance as possible. I try to, whenever I can, I try to take dice rolls out of the equation because people roll boxcars against me like you wouldn't believe.
It also really depends on units too, right? Like if I'm playing Paladors, I don't care if I'm like 20 inches away from my opponent's hammer unit, right? Because it's like, well, I moved 20 myself. So you have to see what your hammer units are compared to your opponent's hammer units and like go from there.
Going back to that same game, Stonehorns only move 10 inches and they have no charge bonuses, so their threat range is usually a 10-inch move and a 12.5-inch charge for a 22.5-inch threat range. The Stormcast player has deployed out of the threat range of all the Stonehorns by deploying over 22.5 inches away from the Ogre player's deployment zone. Of course, in this scenario, the Ogre player can chant a run and charge prayer, but since that's only on a 4+, and since that's only on one monster, this deployment really reduces aggression from the Ogre player. If they just move into the middle of the board, then the Stormcast player can capitalize on that and put a lot of damage into them. We talked about objectives. They are 60% of your score, but the other 40% comes from battle tactics. And battle tactics this season have a mix of attacking, standing on objectives, and being in specific places. And for the purpose of this video, we're going to focus on the order battle tactics because we are the Stormkeep. We talk about Stormcast, so this is what we're concerned with. But do note that order has slightly different tactics than death, chaos, and destruction. The last two there are different. So of the battle tactics that require attacking, 3 of them, slay the entourage, do not waver, and slay the tyrants. There's 1 that requires standing on objectives, which is attack on 2 fronts, and 5 of them just require standing in specific places. That's take their land, seize the center, take the flanks, and reclaim the realms. And it's important to try to score a battle tactic in every turn as much as you can. It's very easy to fall behind on points if you are not scoring battle tactics. And it's much easier to score battle tactics if you think about them in your deployment. So think about which one you want to try to score in round 1 when you're deploying. And this ties into the question of who's going first. If you think your opponent is going to make you go first, you can try to position units for an easy battle tactic. So some quick things you can do. Take note of which terrain can be used to score Take Their Land. Take Their Land is one of the easiest tactics. It doesn't require usually rolling any dice, and there's usually little counterplay available. You can also try to place units in range in order to move so that they can take the flanks. You can also choose not to deploy a unit on an objective in order to make attack on 2 fronts easier, because you need to take control of 2 objectives, and only one of them has to be an objective your opponent controlled. Be wary of scoring Seize the Center early on. This could be a massive overextension from you, especially if you're going at the top of 1 and your opponent gets a double turn and you've placed any kind of units in the middle of the board. Those are usually a free pickup, and not more than that, they also act as a bridge for your opponent to then later charge into your army on a double turn. And it's also worth noting that Reclaim the Realms can be scored with reserves and teleports. So if you're an army that has access to those, like Stormcast, then trying to keep a couple units in reserve for this tactic is a good idea. It is important to know that opponents can do things to deny your battle tactics. We talked about this in episode 74 when we looked at casting a spell to block somebody from setting up and scoring Take Their Land. There's ways to mess with battle tactics, so you may even want to consider deploying to score multiple tactics. Maybe you put 2 units in range to score Take the Flanks, and you have some reserve units in range ready to reclaim the realms or Take Their Land as well. And of course, you can deploy in order to counter your opponent's battle tactics, but that is really, really complicated. It's more complicated than what I want to get in this video. Maybe if we make a deployment 102, we'll talk about that. What you should be focusing on is scoring your own points before you worry about denying your opponent. That's more advanced territory. In this game, the Stormcast player declared Take Their Land on the tree in the opponent's territory, teleporting the Lord Arcanum nearby to score it. Since the Lumineth player had deployed so defensively, there was nothing they could do to stop it. They didn't have a teleporting spell that could potentially block that. The Stormcast player also did have Prosecutors in range in case they did suddenly teleport a unit on there. Here's a quick mock-up of what you can do to set up for Take the Flanks on Jaws of Gallet. There are Liberators in the top left and Gryph-hounds in the bottom right. Liberators move 5 inches, so they can be set up within 6 inches of the territory boundary because you can run 1 inch guaranteed, so no risk involved. You can be minimum 6 inches away. You could set them up further if you wanted to use a command point for on the double to get run 6. then you could potentially set the Liberators up 11 inches away, and this may be preferable depending on what your opponent deploys across from you. The Gryph-hounds in the bottom right are set up on the boundary line because Gryph-hounds move 9 inches, and they need to get higher than a 9-inch move, which means a run roll of 1 inch will be enough to get within 6 inches of the edge of the battlefield. Take the flanks only requires a unit within 6 inches of the table edge, not wholly within your territory. Now, this kind of deployment can be risky because you're committing multiple units into the corners and closer to the enemy army. In this game, the Stormcast player did not deploy to score any specific battle tactic. Since he had fewer drops than his opponent, he planned on making the opponent go first, and then he could play reactively instead. This battle plan in particular strongly encourages moving units to the midfield objectives, and then the Stormcast player with his high threat ranges can play reactively rather than proactively. But this sort of thinking really only applies if you know you're controlling who goes first in that game. The last thing I want to talk about in this video is reserve units. We always get this kind of question: which units should go in reserve? And unfortunately, there is no right or wrong answer. It always depends on the situation. Just like everything else in deployment, it depends on the battle plan, it depends on your list, it depends on your opponent's list, it depends on who the attacker and defender is, it depends on where the terrain is. There's all these factors that need to be considered. But I can try to give some basic tips for you guys. The first thing to consider with reserve units is that most reserve abilities set up units in the movement phase, which means units that are picked for abilities can't use abilities while they're in reserve. This usually means hero phase buffs can't be applied to these units, and these units can't use spells or prayers or anything like that. So units that I would usually deploy on the battlefield are units with deployment phase abilities, for example, Bastion or Questor Soulsworn. These abilities have to be used while they're on the battlefield. I would also generally put units with hero phase abilities like wizards, priests, other support heroes, anything that you want to buff units or try to debuff opponents. I would try to put those on the battlefield as well. I would also consider units that I want to give buffs to in the hero phase. I would put them on the table. For example, I would generally put prosecutors on the table so that I can give them Finest Hour and cast other spells on them. I would also usually put a fast melee unit like cavalry on the battlefield directly because they're fast enough that they don't need to rely on a 9-inch charge, which is not reliable. You should never be banking on 9-inch charges. That is not a good way to play. I would also consider putting screens down to protect these other important units from charges. I would consider putting units to score or take the flanks in the first round. I would also sometimes put shooting units down on the table in order to attack enemies with covering fire. This can be a huge deterrent, especially if your opponent tries to do something like take the flanks or seize the center, and you already have a unit in range in order to do covering fire. I would also generally consider putting large base models like monsters on the battlefield. They're usually fast enough, and it can be very difficult to find space more than 9 inches from enemies. Opponents can make it really, really difficult by spreading their army out and really limiting where you can land that monster, especially with how much terrain should be on the table. It can be very tough. Units that I would put in reserve, generally any unit you want to protect from enemy abilities. If you have a fragile unit that your opponent has a very high threat range and you say, oh, I definitely can't have him hitting this unit first before I hit them, I would put that unit in reserve. I would also consider putting slow units in reserve. So screens, liberators, vigilors, things like that. These are disposable units that can take objectives, or you can drop them into play in terrain choke points to slow your opponent down for a turn. I would also consider putting melee units with strong bonuses to charge rolls. So, for example, if you're playing Annihilators and you bring Gavriel and a Lord Imperator and Gardas and you give them all these crazy buffs to charges, or you just have Prosecutors, which have a 3d6 charge, I would consider putting those into reserve. They can't be hit until they come into play, and then they have a reliable way of getting into combat. In general, I put shooting units into reserve. I would put Castigators, Judicators, Long Strikes, unless you're trying to get a very sneaky covering fire. I would put these units in reserve because it's quite easy to get into position from reserve. Sometimes you may want to put a wizard in reserve so that you can drop them into play closer to your opponent in order to unbind. You do give up casting a spell on the first turn with this, but it may be worthwhile if you want to make sure you can get in range to unbind. I would also consider putting units with strike first in the opponent's turn in reserve. For example, a Lord Terminus with Quicksilver Draft and 6 Reclusians. This is a very common unit that goes into reserve. You drop it into a tactically useful position. Your opponent will be forced to charge into it, say a choke point or something like that, and then you get to hit them first. If you're curious about this combo, you can check out our Quicksilver Draft video that we made a few weeks back. What are some units you really like putting in reserve? Like your typical go-to? I know you've got your Rapid Assault list we talked about on Lords of the Storm. from that list, for example, what would you put into reserve?
Usually both my Cascader units and my Vigilers. Really anything that shoots, I like to put in reserve. Um, I don't think really outside of slaves will they really want to like come try to charge you top of one across the board. Most people in armies are just not going to do that because it's just not tactically smart. So you could really, I try to stretch out our reserves for Stormcast as much as possible. So like if you have 8 units, like if there's 4 good units you can put in the sky, like put 4 units in the sky. Like it's free tactical mobility. You don't give your opponent, you give your opponent less information because now they have to be like, oh well, I gotta figure out where these guys might drop, right? Um, and it really the reserves really does stretch your opponent in like their movement because they have to be even more precise, right? Because if they leave you a small hole to fit, 12 cascaders or something, that might be the that might next turn might just pick up like one of their really good units, right? It might pick up Manfred, it might pick up Urshron, it might pick up a 6 block of knights, right? So like I always try to put as much as I can in reserve because it gives my opponent less information and it makes them have to tighten up their movement.
All right, so here, now it gets complicated. Countering reserve melee units, and then we'll talk about countering reserve shooting units later. This is a very important part of deployment because you don't want to just have your opponent get some lucky 9-inch roll charges and just roll over your army at the top of turn 1. It's not a fun experience, and it's something you can completely avoid with good placement and good strategy, regardless of which army you play. Except Gargants. Gargants, sorry. Reserve units are usually set up over 9 inches from enemy units, and for a 9-inch charge, that is a 28% chance or 48% with a reroll ability. But most importantly, this is not 0. It is effectively a coin flip, and you don't want to lose the game to a coin flip. And some units even get bonuses to charge rolls. There are 3d6 charges, there are +1, plus d3. 3d6 charges in particular are very strong. They have a 74% chance of making it, or a 93% with a reroll. So there's 3 things you can do to deal with reserve melee units. First up, just redeploy. If they only deploy in range to charge 1 unit, a 4-up redeploy makes the charge impossible, assuming you have the room to move back. You might be backed up against the edge of the battlefield, or you might have units in the way, or you might have terrain in the way. But if you have space, a redeploy is usually a good tactic. It does effectively reduce their charge by d6, making it a 1d6 charge, but it does cost a precious command point, and it's random. You may not be able to move back enough to get you out of their charge range. So this is a good strategy. It's one to keep in mind, but it's not a foolproof strategy. Another way to deal with this is to deny space to set up. Support heroes and screens can be set up on flanks, and when your army's moving forward, you can set up manifestations behind you to continue denying space. As per core rules section 24.0, you must set up all models in that unit. So consider the footprint of the unit that you're dealing with. You don't have to block all the space, you just have to block enough space that the unit can't deploy. Sometimes reserves can be set up anywhere on the battlefield, but sometimes they have to be set up wholly within 6 inches of a table edge. Units like Riverblades from Lumineth are more restricted in their movement and therefore are easier to control. Of course, you can't screen out the whole table, so this is not a foolproof tactic, but you can control where they come into play and which units are in range. Tactic 3 is to screen it out. You just assume that they will make the charge, and you put a screening unit in the way, something disposable, something cheap. This is not a foolproof tactic. There are, for example, units with fly can just fly past your screens. Like prosecutors are really good for this. They not only are reliable chargers with their 3d6 charge, they can also shoot at screens to soften them up and then fly and charge past them potentially. They still can't end a move in the space taken up by another model, so if you want to deny them from jumping over you, you could do something like put models behind your first rank of screens, have 2 layers of screens effectively. You can use terrain to your advantage by creating choke points. You can create a choke point with faction terrain. And keep in mind that shooting can kill your screens, but if you set up properly, you can be prepared for this. And I have an example coming up that'll explain this well. So first up, a very simple example of zoning is using the battlefield edge to your advantage. In this example, Krondus is deployed such that the corner of the battlefield is less than 9 inches away from him. There is no space for a unit to set up anywhere in that corner. But this seems inefficient. We can squeeze it a little bit further. Let's say you're trying to zone out 5 Liberators in reserve. Well, 5 Liberators take up space, and the whole unit has to be able to set up. At this distance, a unit of 5 40mm bases can't fit. One of the bases, you'll notice, is hanging off the battlefield. So this unit of Liberators cannot be set up in the corner. These extra few inches allow Krondys to get closer to the middle, which could be strategically useful. And when Krondys moves up, he will leave that space open. However, before moving, Krondys can summon a moving manifestation to continue zoning out this area. And ideally, this manifestation will summon more than 30 inches away from all units that can use banish abilities, so your opponent has to deal with it in the shooting and combat phases rather than in the hero phase before movement happens. Here's an example of using terrain to your advantage. The Stormcast player has set up a Stormreach portal to create a 3-inch choke point, and they have placed 5 Liberators in between the 2 pieces of terrain. Enemies can charge the portal, but they can't move through it, and they can't move through the Liberators until they're destroyed. Also worth noting that models can't set up within 9 inches of the Liberators, so across from the impassable terrain, they must go the whole way around the terrain, which in this case ends up being more than 12 inches. So usually your opponent will not be able to charge you like this. There are, of course, other angles that these Liberators could be approached, but this is just one part of a whole strategy. Let's look at an example of when your opponent drops in a melee unit and a shooting unit in order to kill a screen. In this case, an enemy melee unit is set up more than 9 inches from the Liberator. A shooting unit was also set up in order to destroy the Liberator screen. However, the Vigilors and Knight Incantor are over 3.5 inches from the front line. Let's say they are 13 inches away from the chariot that's set up. Well, once the Liberators are destroyed by the shooting unit, there's nothing left within 12.5 inches of the chariot, so it can't declare a charge, since there's no viable space for it to finish the charge. And this only works because the Vigilors were over 3.5 inches from the front line, and now there's nothing left to charge. Let's look at another example where you have multiple units that are charging. These Liberators were set up in a choke point between terrain, and the Vigilors were again more than 3.5 inches from the front line. The opponent charges in with 2 units. Unit B activates and wipes out the Liberator screen. This then allows Unit A to pile in 3 inches and get in combat range with the Vigilors. Even if the Vigilors survive, they will be stuck in combat and not able to shoot. However, if the Vigilors were placed over 6 inches from the front line instead of 3 inches, Unit B will activate, it will destroy the Liberators, but when Unit A activates, it will not be able to get within combat range of the Vigilors because they're further away. The Vigilors will be able to move and shoot freely in their next turn. And the last subject I want to cover is to counter reserve shooting units. Just like with reserve melee units, we're going to deploy 3 different tactics, each of them with varying efficacy. The first tactic is to redeploy. Since units are set up more than 9 inches from enemies, and most shooting in the game is somewhere between 10 and 18 inches, redeploying is actually a very viable way to get out of shooting range. For 10-inch shooting, all you need is a 1-inch redeploy. And so you are guaranteed to get away from 10-inch shooting. This is very useful against things like Dracoths or Prosecutors, or all the other various 10-inch range shooting units. For 12-inch shooting, like Vanguard Raptors with Hurricane crossbows, you can do a 3-inch redeploy and get out of range of their shooting. This is not guaranteed, it is risky, but it is a risk that you are weighted to succeed at, because a 3+ is probably good enough that you can spend a command point on that. 15-inch shooting, well, that requires a 6-inch redeploy. That's a very risky, I'm going to spend a command point and hope I roll a 6 kind of play. You're very lucky if you get this. It shouldn't be something you rely on. And 18-inch shooting, yeah, you're just getting shot, bro. You cannot redeploy out of that. Unless you're able to redeploy into some obscuring cover or something like that. Second way to deal with reserve shooting is to deny the space to shoot it up. Now, this is the same as melee units, but obviously much more difficult because they shoot. They don't need to charge. They will have stuff in range. At least what you can do is try to set up your units such that when the opponent comes into play, you will be wholly on or behind obscuring terrain. The third tactic, you can't really stop your opponent from shooting you, but you can choose what they shoot at. Since their units are set up more than 9 inches from enemies, if you set up your units far enough, you can be out of range of being shot. 12-inch range shooting requires setting up over 3 inches from the front line. 18-inch range shooting requires setting up over 9 inches from the front line. You can also try to get wholly on or behind obscuring terrain so that even your screens can't be shot. Abilities that prevent enemies from targeting you with shooting attacks like the Mirror Shield can be very useful in this situation. In this example, Krondus is set up over 9 inches away from the Liberators and over 9 inches away from the front of the Chariot. When your opponent sets up units, like the Vigilors for example, when these Vigilors set up, their 18-inch range shooting will not be in range of Krondus. This may not always be something you can set up with deployment, but if you have hero phase movement or setup abilities like magical intervention with translocate, these can create these situations in a pinch. You could teleport the Liberators forward and make it impossible for your opponent to shoot Krondus in this turn. And that'll do it for this video. Thank you very much for watching. I hope this was interesting. I hope I kept it under 20 minutes, although probably not. It's probably going to be longer than that. Sorry, guys. They're not really quick tips anymore, are they? Oh well. Thanks for watching, especially to our Patreon supporters and YouTube members. You guys make all of this worthwhile. If you think we missed anything or our analysis is lacking, please leave a comment down below in the video. If you want to talk about AOS, feel free to join the Stormkeep Discord server. Many of the photos used in this video were taken from battle reports I've put on the Discord server. If you want to see these full battle reports, including my thoughts all the way from deployment to the end of the game, you can just hop on our Discord server and access them for free. We have a wonderful community of painters. Painting contests will be resuming soon because we have secured a new sponsor, so look forward to that. And we do list building for all armies, not just Stormcast, so if you're a Gits player looking for advice, feel free to jump in. Also consider supporting the gang here on the Stormkeep by becoming a member on YouTube or joining us on patreon.com/thestormkeep. For $5 a month, you can get early access to all our videos and access to all the slides that we use in the videos. That'll do it for us this time. Thanks again, and we'll see you in the next one.